The rocking chair in the nursery moved by itself at 3:17 a.m. on November 5, 1859, creaking a lullaby that no living voice had sung for 7 months, while something small and pale watched from the corner, where shadows gathered like mourners around an empty crib. The floorboards beneath the chair showed deep grooves worn smooth by endless motion, as if grief itself had weight enough to carve wood into memory. This is the story of a child whose death was so wrong that even heaven rejected her claim, leaving her trapped between worlds in a Virginia mansion where love became a prison and salvation became impossible. Whitmore Manor stood on the banks of the James River, where the sound of water moving over stones mixed with the creak of settling timber and the whisper of wind through gaps in window frames that had never quite fit properly. The smell inside was layered beeswax candles, old leather, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of flowers left too long in stagnant water. Every surface felt damp to the touch, as if the house itself wept constantly for sins it couldn't confess. Margaret Whitmore had built the mansion in 1856 as a monument to prosperity earned through tobacco plantations that stretched across 3 counties. But prosperity built on others' suffering carries its own weight, and by 1859, that weight had begun to crush everything it touched, including Margaret's 7-year-old daughter, Patience. Personal Journal, Margaret Whitmore. October 12, 1859. Patience grows stranger each day. She speaks to empty rooms and laughs at jokes no one tells. The doctor says it is merely imagination, but I fear something else entirely. The child had always been different, too quiet, too observant, too willing to accept punishment for crimes she hadn't committed. While other children played with dolls and hoops, Patience collected dead birds and arranged them in careful patterns beneath her bedroom window. She spoke to servants in languages she'd never learned and knew things about the plantation's history that no child should understand. But it was Patience's relationship with the house slaves that truly disturbed her mother. The girl would sit for hours listening to their stories about the old country, about spirits that crossed water, about children who died before their time and couldn't find their way home. She learned songs in African dialects and drew symbols on her bedroom walls that looked like nothing any civilized child should know. Innocence became something darker. Margaret's husband, Thomas Whitmore, owned 437 enslaved people who worked his tobacco fields from dawn until darkness swallowed their shadows. The plantation operated with the mechanical efficiency of men who'd learned to ignore screams, to overlook scars, to calculate human worth in pounds of leaf tobacco and bushels of grain. But Thomas had noticed something troubling about his daughter's behavior. Patience would disappear for hours, later found in the slave quarters, sharing meals with people who were legally his property. She'd return to the manor house, speaking in tongues and humming melodies that sounded like work songs, but carried undertones that made grown men uncomfortable. The breaking point came on October 28, 1859, when Margaret discovered Patience in the plantation's punishment shed, sitting beside a teenage slave girl who'd been whipped for attempting to run away. Patience was cleaning the girl's wounds with strips torn from her own dress, whispering in a language that sounded like water flowing over stone. Medical report, Dr. A. Edmund Carey, November 1, 1859. Child presents with symptoms of hysteria, complicated by unnatural attachment to inferior races. Recommend immediate correction through isolation and religious instruction. Margaret's solution was confinement. She locked Patience in the nursery that had been prepared for a younger sibling who died at birth, a room that smelled of unused hope and furniture that had never served its purpose. The child would remain there until she learned proper behavior, proper thinking, proper submission to her station as a white woman in Virginia society. But Patience didn't learn proper behavior. Instead, she learned to speak with voices that answered from empty air. She learned to move objects without touching them. She learned to appear in multiple locations simultaneously, confusing servants who swore they'd seen her in the garden while she remained locked in her room. What would you do if your child began displaying abilities that challenged everything you believed about the natural world? How far would you go to correct behavior that seemed to threaten the very foundation of your social order? Margaret's attempts to force Patience into conformity became increasingly desperate, but the child's connection to something beyond the visible world only grew stronger, and the house itself began to respond to her presence in ways that would soon transform Whitmore Manor from a symbol of prosperity into a monument to the terrible price of trying to cage what was never meant to be contained. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this story has already gotten under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we uncover next will reveal how a mother's love became the very force that condemned her daughter to an eternity of wandering between worlds that would never claim her as their own. Margaret Whitmore turned the brass key in the nursery door at 6:43 a.m. on November 3, 1859, sealing her daughter inside a room where morning light filtered through curtains that had been sewn shut to prevent the child from signaling to slaves working in the fields below. The sound of that key turning would echo through Whitmore Manor for the next 4 days, marking time until silence replaced the small voice that had been asking too many dangerous questions. When parents choose punishment over understanding, they risk creating the very monsters they claim to be protecting their children from becoming. The nursery had been designed as a sanctuary hand-painted wallpaper depicting scenes of childhood innocence. A mahogany crib carved with angels, toys imported from London shops that specialized in amusements for wealthy children. But Margaret's modifications had transformed the space into something else entirely. Heavy bars now covered the windows. The door had been reinforced with iron brackets. Even the fireplace had been sealed to prevent any possibility of escape. Patience accepted her imprisonment with the same unsettling calm she'd shown throughout her short life. She didn't cry, didn't beg for release, didn't promise to behave properly if given another chance. Instead, she arranged her few possessions with methodical precision and began speaking to someone Margaret couldn't see. The conversations were never one-sided. Dr. Edmund Carey visited the manor on November 4th to examine Patience and recommend treatment for what Margaret described as unnatural fixations and rebellious spirit. The physician found the child sitting in the corner of her locked room, humming a melody that sounded like something he'd heard slaves singing in the tobacco fields. "Patience," Dr. Carey said, kneeling beside her small form. "Your mother is concerned about your behavior. She wants to help you become a proper young lady." The child looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her 7 years. "The proper young ladies are the ones who pretend not to hear the screaming," she replied. "I hear everything, even the things that happened before I was born." Plantation Records, Thomas Whitmore, November 4, 1859. Dr. Carey reports child shows signs of mental disturbance requiring isolation treatment. Recommend continued confinement until symptoms subside. Dr. Carey prescribed a regimen that reflected the medical understanding of 1859: complete isolation, restricted diet, and regular doses of laudanum to calm what he diagnosed as nervous excitation brought on by excessive stimulation of the moral faculties. The treatment was designed to break Patience's will while preserving her social utility as a future wife and mother. But the treatment had unintended consequences. Cut off from human contact, Patience's conversations with invisible companions grew longer and more detailed. Servants reported hearing multiple voices from the locked nursery. Adult voices, speaking in languages that sounded like African dialects, mixed with something else, something that predated human speech entirely. Margaret monitored her daughter's condition through the keyhole, watching Patience arrange and rearrange objects in patterns that seemed meaningful but followed no logic Margaret could understand. The child would sit for hours, moving buttons, ribbon scraps, and dried flowers into configurations that resembled maps of places that didn't exist on any atlas. Isolation bred more than madness. On November 6th, something changed in the nursery's atmosphere. The temperature dropped despite the sealed fireplace continuing to radiate warmth from coals that had been banked the previous evening. Margaret noticed frost forming on the inside of windows, and the curtains moved as if touched by wind that couldn't exist in a room with no air circulation. That night, servants reported hearing children's laughter from empty rooms throughout the manor house. Multiple children playing games that involved running up and down staircases, slamming doors, and singing songs in languages no one recognized. But when investigated, the rooms contained no evidence of disturbance except for the lingering scent of flowers that had been dead for months. Thomas Whitmore dismissed these reports as nervous speculation brought on by the stress of having a disturbed child in the house. He'd built his fortune by ignoring inconvenient truths about human suffering, and he applied the same selective blindness to his daughter's situation. Whitmore Family Bible, ECC, margin note, November 7, 1859. Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. But what of children heaven will not claim? The question, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, revealed her growing fear that Patience's condition was beyond medical treatment or religious intervention. The child had always been different, but confinement had amplified those differences into something that challenged basic assumptions about childhood, innocence, and the nature of the soul itself. What would you do if your attempts to correct your child's behavior only made her more determined to embrace the very things you were trying to eliminate? How far would you go to save a daughter who seemed intent on damning herself? Margaret's answer would come on November 7th, when her daughter's voice stopped echoing from behind the locked nursery door, and something far more disturbing began to manifest in its place. Something that would force the Whitmore family to confront the possibility that some children are born already belonging to worlds that exist beyond the reach of parental control or social correction. Margaret Whitmore pressed her ear to the nursery door at dawn on November 8, 1859, hearing nothing but the kind of absolute silence that exists only in places where something has stopped breathing forever. The brass key felt cold in her trembling fingers as she turned it for the first time in 5 days, opening the door to find her daughter's small body curled beneath the window where frost had formed impossible patterns that looked like maps of places that existed only in nightmares. When a parent's worst fears prove inadequate preparation for reality, the mind creates new categories of horror that have no names and no remedies. Patience lay in a pool of morning sunlight that should have been warm but felt cold as December wind. Her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that comes only with death, but her eyes remained open, staring at something in the corner where shadows gathered despite the brightness streaming through the barred windows. Dr. Carey would later record that her body showed no signs of violence, disease, or obvious cause of death. The child appeared to have simply decided to stop living, as if existence had become an inconvenience she no longer wished to endure. But the expression on her face wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like someone waiting for a door to open or a voice to call her name. Death certificate, DODAT. Dr. S. Echo, Edmund Carey, November 8, 1859. Cause of death, natural causes, possibly heart failure, brought on by nervous excitement. No evidence of external trauma or poisoning detected. Margaret's screams brought servants running from throughout the manor house, but their relief at finding the strange child finally at rest lasted only until they attempted to move her body. Patience's corpse refused to remain where they placed it. No matter how carefully they arranged her limbs, she would be found hours later in different positions, as if she'd been moving around the room while no one was watching. The undertaker, Samuel Morrison, arrived that afternoon to prepare the body for burial, but his examination revealed disturbing anomalies. Patience's flesh remained warm despite hours of apparent death. Her hair continued to grow, requiring trimming before the funeral. Most unsettling, her fingernails had grown long enough to scratch deep grooves into the wooden floor around her bed. Thomas Whitmore insisted on immediate burial, but the family's Presbyterian minister, Reverend Jonathan Miles, refused to perform funeral rites after examining the child's body. He claimed that something about her condition suggested she wasn't truly dead, despite all medical evidence pointing toward natural expiration. The dead don't scratch messages. Morrison discovered words carved into the nursery floor when he moved Patience's body to prepare it for burial. The letters were crude but readable, scratched deep enough into the wood that they couldn't be sanded away without destroying the floorboards entirely. The message read, "They won't let me leave." Margaret demanded to know who they might be, but Morrison had no answers. The scratches appeared fresh despite being made by someone who'd been dead for hours. The fingernails that created them showed no signs of damage from the effort required to carve letters into hardwood flooring. Servants reported that the temperature in the nursery had dropped so dramatically that water froze in wash basins left near the windows. Candles wouldn't stay lit in the room, no matter how carefully they were shielded from drafts. Even the manor's hunting dogs refused to enter the space, whimpering and backing away from the doorframe as if they sensed something human perception couldn't detect. Some deaths refused to take. The funeral was scheduled for November 10th, but preparations proved impossible to complete. The coffin Samuel Morrison had constructed to Patience's measurements was found broken apart each morning, its planks scattered around the nursery as if something inside had torn it apart from within. 3 different coffins suffered the same fate before Morrison admitted defeat and recommended immediate burial without proper ceremony. But burial required a body that would remain still long enough to transport to the cemetery, and Patience's corpse had developed the disturbing habit of changing positions when no one was watching. Morrison would position her properly in the makeshift pine box, only to return minutes later and find her sitting upright, staring at whoever entered the room with eyes that tracked movement despite being clouded with death. Margaret began to suspect that her daughter's death was incomplete, that some part of Patience remained anchored to the world by bonds stronger than the grave could break. The child's attachment to the enslaved people, her conversations with invisible companions, her knowledge of things no 7-year-old should understand. All of it suggested connections that death couldn't sever. Death became another form of imprisonment. On November 11th, Morrison made a discovery that changed everything. While attempting to move Patience's body for the 4th time, he noticed that the scratched message on the floor had changed. New words had appeared overnight, carved in the same crude lettering. The house remembers everything. What would you do if you discovered that death wasn't the end of your child's suffering, but simply another stage in a punishment that seemed to have no conclusion? How would you find peace knowing that your attempts to correct her behavior had trapped her in a state worse than any earthly confinement? Margaret was about to learn that some children are born carrying debts that previous generations accumulated, and Patience's death was just the beginning of a reckoning that would transform Whitmore Manor into a monument to crimes that slavery had made invisible, but which a dead child's eyes could see with perfect clarity. The first slave quarters caught fire at midnight on November 12, 1859, blazing with flames that cast dancing shadows across the manor house walls, while something small and white moved from window to window inside Whitmore Manor. Watching the destruction with eyes that reflected firelight like polished glass, the enslaved families fled into the night, carrying only the clothes on their backs, but behind them the fire spread with unnatural precision, consuming only the buildings where the worst punishments had been administered. When the dead refused to stay buried, they sometimes used the only power left to them, the ability to expose secrets that the living spent generations trying to hide. Margaret stood on the manor's front porch, watching 4 centuries of accumulated guilt burn itself clean. while Thomas shouted orders to servants who were too terrified to approach flames that seemed to move with deliberate intelligence. The fire consumed the whipping post first, then the punishment shed, then the overseer's quarters, where records were kept of every beating, every rape, every child sold away from parents who would never see them again. But the most disturbing aspect of the fire wasn't its selective destruction. It was the figure Margaret glimpsed moving through the smoke. A small girl in a white nightgown, walking calmly through flames that should have killed her instantly, pointing at buildings with the methodical precision of someone settling old accounts. Plantation Overseer's Report. Final entry. November 12, 1859. Cannot explain fire pattern. Quarters housing most troublesome slaves burned completely, while others untouched. Recommend immediate sale of remaining property before situation worsens. The morning after the fire revealed the true scope of what Patience's death had unleashed. The slave quarters that burned had been rebuilt multiple times, over 30 years, always in the same locations, always using timber that came from trees where enslaved people had been hanged for trying to escape. The fire had consumed not just buildings, but the very ground they stood on, leaving craters that exposed bones buried so long their origins were lost to official memory. Dr. Carey returned to examine Patience's body and found that death had transformed her appearance in ways that defied medical explanation. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed veins like dark rivers beneath marble. Her hair had grown 3 inches overnight and changed color from brown to silver white. Most disturbing, her fingernails had continued growing, now long enough to have carved the increasingly detailed messages that appeared each morning on the nursery floor. The latest message was longer than previous ones, carved in letters deep enough to splinter the floorboards. 37 children sold south. 14 mothers died of grief. Samuel hung for stealing food for his family. The dead kept better records than the living. Thomas recognized some of the names that appeared in Patience's scratched messages. Slaves he'd sold to cover gambling debts. Children he'd separated from families to maximize profit. Men and women whose deaths had been recorded as natural causes when they were actually consequences of deliberate cruelty. But Patience's messages revealed details that no 7-year-old could have known. Dates of sales that occurred before her birth. Names of buyers who'd purchased human beings at auctions conducted in secret locations. Financial arrangements that existed only in account books kept locked in Thomas's private study. Margaret began to understand that her daughter's conversations with invisible companions had been literal truth. Patience had been speaking with the spirits of enslaved people who died on Whitmore property, learning their stories, recording their grievances, preparing to serve as their advocate in a court that existed beyond earthly jurisdiction. Some witnesses cannot be silenced. The surviving enslaved people confirmed details from Patience's messages when questioned by authorities investigating the suspicious fires. They knew stories about people who died decades earlier, passed down through generations of forced labor, but they'd never spoken those stories aloud where white people could hear them, until now. Emboldened by fires that seemed to target only the sources of their oppression, they began testimony that documented crimes spanning 30 years of plantation operation. Murders disguised as accidents. Sexual assault treated as property rights. Children torn from families and sold to buyers who specialized in breaking young spirits before they could develop resistance. Thomas attempted to silence these revelations by threatening immediate sale of anyone who spoke to outside authorities. But his threats had lost their power. The enslaved people had watched supernatural fires consume the instruments of their torture while leaving their own quarters untouched. They'd seen a dead white child serve as their advocate from beyond the grave. Fear had changed sides. On November 15th, Samuel Morrison made a discovery that forced even the most skeptical observers to acknowledge that Patience's death involved forces beyond natural explanation. Her body had disappeared from the makeshift coffin where he'd placed it the previous evening, but a search of the manor revealed something far more disturbing. Patience appeared in multiple locations. Simultaneously, servants reported seeing her in the kitchen, the library, the basement, and the slave quarters at the same time. Each sighting involved the same small figure in a white nightgown, always pointing at specific locations where evidence of cruelty had been hidden or denied. What would you do if you realized that your child's death had given her access to knowledge that could destroy everything your family had built over generations? How far would you go to silence revelations that came from someone who could no longer be threatened or controlled? Thomas Whitmore was about to discover that some secrets are too heavy for graves to hold, and Patience's transformation from obedient daughter to supernatural prosecutor would soon force him to choose between confessing to crimes that slavery had made legal and facing consequences that no earthly court had power to impose. The first slave quarters caught fire at midnight on November 12, 1859, blazing with flames that cast dancing shadows across the manor house walls, while something small and white moved from window to window inside Whitmore Manor, watching the destruction with eyes that reflected firelight like polished glass. The enslaved families fled into the night, carrying only the clothes on their backs. But behind them, the fire spread with unnatural precision, consuming only the buildings where the worst punishments had been administered. When the dead refused to stay buried, they sometimes used the only power left to them, the ability to expose secrets that the living spent generations trying to hide. Margaret stood on the manor's front porch, watching 4 centuries of accumulated guilt burn itself clean, while Thomas shouted orders to servants who were too terrified to approach flames that seemed to move with deliberate intelligence. The fire consumed the whipping post first, then the punishment shed, then the overseer's quarters, where records were kept of every beating, every rape, every child sold away from parents who would never see them again. But the most disturbing aspect of the fire wasn't its selective destruction. It was the figure Margaret glimpsed moving through the smoke. A small girl in a white nightgown, walking calmly through flames that should have killed her instantly, pointing at buildings with the methodical precision of someone settling old accounts. Plantation Overseer's Report, DHT. Final entry November 12, 1859. Cannot explain fire pattern. Quarters housing most troublesome slaves burned completely, while others untouched. Recommend immediate sale of remaining property before situation worsens. The morning after the fire revealed the true scope of what Patience's death had unleashed. The slave quarters that burned had been rebuilt multiple times over 30 years, always in the same locations, always using timber that came from trees where enslaved people had been hanged for trying to escape. The fire had consumed not just buildings, but the very ground they stood on, leaving craters that exposed bones buried so long their origins were lost to official memory. Dr. Carey returned to examine Patience's body and found that death had transformed her appearance in ways that defied medical explanation. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed veins like dark rivers beneath marble. Her hair had grown 3 inches overnight and changed color from brown to silver white. Most disturbing, her fingernails had continued growing, now long enough to have carved the increasingly detailed messages that appeared each morning on the nursery floor. The latest message was longer than previous ones, carved in letters deep enough to splinter the floorboards. 37 children sold south. 14 mothers died of grief. Samuel hung for stealing food for his family. The dead kept better records than the living. Thomas recognized some of the names that appeared in Patience's scratched messages: slaves he'd sold to cover gambling debts, children he'd separated from families to maximize profit, men and women whose deaths had been recorded as natural causes when they were actually consequences of deliberate cruelty. But Patience's messages revealed details that no 7-year-old could have known. Dates of sales that occurred before her birth, names of buyers who'd purchased human beings at auctions conducted in secret locations, financial arrangements that existed only in account books kept locked in Thomas's private study. Margaret began to understand that her daughter's conversations with invisible companions had been literal truth. Patience had been speaking with the spirits of enslaved people who died on Whitmore property, learning their stories, recording their grievances, preparing to serve as their advocate in a court that existed beyond earthly jurisdiction. Some witnesses cannot be silenced. The surviving enslaved people confirmed details from Patience's messages when questioned by authorities investigating the suspicious fires. They knew stories about people who died decades earlier, passed down through generations of forced labor. But they'd never spoken those stories aloud where white people could hear them. Until now. Emboldened by fires that seemed to target only the sources of their oppression, they began testimony that documented crimes spanning 30 years of plantation operation, murders disguised as accidents, sexual assault treated as property rights, children torn from families and sold to buyers who specialized in breaking young spirits before they could develop resistance. Thomas attempted to silence these revelations by threatening immediate sale of anyone who spoke to outside authorities, but his threats had lost their power. The enslaved people had watched supernatural fires consume the instruments of their torture while leaving their own quarters untouched. They'd seen a dead white child serve as their advocate from beyond the grave. Fear had changed sides. On November 15th, Samuel Morrison made a discovery that forced even the most skeptical observers to acknowledge that Patience's death involved forces beyond natural explanation. Her body had disappeared from the makeshift coffin where he'd placed it the previous evening, but a search of the manor revealed something far more disturbing. Patience appeared in multiple locations. Simultaneously, servants reported seeing her in the kitchen, the library, the basement, and the slave quarters at the same time. Each sighting involved the same small figure in a white nightgown, always pointing at specific locations where evidence of cruelty had been hidden or denied. What would you do if you realized that your child's death had given her access to knowledge that could destroy everything your family had built over generations? How far would you go to silence revelations that came from someone who could no longer be threatened or controlled? Thomas Whitmore was about to discover that some secrets are too heavy for graves to hold, and Patience's transformation from obedient daughter to supernatural prosecutor would soon force him to choose between confessing to crimes that slavery had made legal and facing consequences that no earthly court had power to impose. Thomas Whitmore found his private study ransacked at dawn on November 16, 1859, with account ledgers scattered across Persian rugs and pages torn from record books that documented 30 years of human transactions, now arranged in neat piles according to categories that revealed the mathematical precision of his cruelty. Standing in the doorway was Patience, her translucent form holding a quill pen that dripped ink the color of dried blood onto papers that recorded crimes no living witness had dared to catalog. When the dead gain access to evidence that the living spent lifetimes concealing, justice becomes inevitable, regardless of earthly statutes of limitations or social conventions that protect the powerful. The ransacked study revealed the scope of Thomas's operations beyond simple plantation management. He'd served as a broker for other slaveholders, arranging sales of problem slaves to buyers who specialized in breaking spirits through methods too brutal for local application. Children who showed signs of intelligence were sold to purchasers who valued youth and curiosity for purposes that decent society didn't acknowledge. Patience's ghostly form moved through the scattered papers with methodical efficiency, using her supernatural abilities to organize evidence according to criteria that would maximize its impact on anyone who discovered the truth. Financial records were paired with personal letters. Sales receipts were matched with newspaper advertisements seeking runaway slaves who'd actually died in captivity. Virginia County records, missing persons, November 16, 1859. 17 separate inquiries filed regarding enslaved individuals, allegedly sold south, but never arrived at documented destinations. Investigation pending. Margaret discovered Thomas burning documents in the library fireplace, but the flames wouldn't consume papers that Patience had touched. The ghostly child would appear beside the hearth, blowing out fires with breath that carried the chill of winter graves. Documents that should have turned to ash remained perfectly preserved, their ink growing darker and more legible with each failed attempt at destruction. Dr. Carey attempted to perform an exorcism, believing that Patience's spirit could be compelled to move on through proper religious intervention. But his prayers were interrupted by voices speaking in African dialects, responding to his Latin incantations with languages that predated Christian presence in Virginia. The nursery filled with sounds of children singing, women weeping, and men speaking names that had been forbidden to pronounce aloud for decades. The enslaved people on neighboring plantations began arriving at Whitmore Manor, drawn by reports that a dead white child was serving as advocate for their community's grievances. They brought their own testimonies, stories of family members who disappeared, children who'd been sold and never seen again, men and women who died under suspicious circumstances that were never investigated. Some stories waited generations to be told. Patience's manifestations grew stronger with each new witness who arrived at the manor. She began appearing in broad daylight, visible to anyone who looked in her direction, pointing at specific locations where bodies had been buried without ceremony or record. Her ghostly form would stand beside freshly turned earth, waiting until someone understood the significance of ground that had been disturbed and hastily covered. Sheriff William Patterson arrived on November 18th to investigate reports of supernatural disturbances, but his inquiry revealed evidence of crimes that exceeded his jurisdiction. The bodies Patience had identified through her pointing included free black people who'd been murdered for their land, white abolitionists who disappeared while traveling through Virginia, and children of mixed race whose existence had been eliminated to protect white families' reputations. Thomas attempted to flee the plantation, but his carriage broke down at the property's edge, its wheels sinking into ground that had suddenly become soft as quicksand. Patience appeared beside the stranded vehicle, her ghostly form solid enough to open the carriage door and point back toward the manor house with the implacable authority of someone who wouldn't be denied justice. The dead had all the time in the world. Margaret faced a choice between supporting her husband's denials and acknowledging the truth that her daughter's death had unleashed. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records that documented systematic cruelty, testimonies from witnesses who could verify decades of hidden crimes, and a supernatural prosecutor who couldn't be intimidated, bribed, or silenced. But acknowledging Patience's revelations meant accepting that her own comfortable life had been built on suffering so extensive that it had generated enough spiritual weight to prevent a child's soul from finding peace in death. Margaret had lived in the manor house, benefited from its prosperity, and chosen ignorance over knowledge when uncomfortable truths pressed against the edges of her awareness. What would you do if confronted with evidence that everything you'd built, everything you'd accomplished, everything you'd taken pride in, was actually constructed from other people's pain? How would you respond to discovering that your child's death was the price demanded for generations of willful blindness? Margaret's decision would determine whether Patience's haunting served as prelude to justice, or whether the dead child would remain trapped between worlds, forever seeking resolution for crimes that the living were still too cowardly to acknowledge, or too invested in slavery's profits to honestly confront. Margaret Whitmore knelt on the nursery floor at 3 a.m. on November 20th, 1859, pressing her palms against the wooden boards where her daughter's ghostly fingernails had carved testimonies that indicted 3 decades of family prosperity built on methodical torture. The words cut into the wood spelled out names, dates, and details that Margaret had spent years pretending not to notice. But now, Patience's translucent form sat beside her, pointing at each carved letter with the patient determination of someone who had eternity to ensure the truth was finally acknowledged. When a mother chooses to see her child clearly for the first time, she risks discovering that love requires confronting the very foundations of everything she believed about herself and her world. The carved messages had multiplied overnight, covering not just the nursery floor, but climbing the walls like ivy made of accusations. Each name represented someone whose suffering had been transformed into profit, whose pain had purchased Margaret's silk dresses, imported furniture, and social standing among Virginia's plantation elite. Margaret read the names aloud, for the first time in her life, not the sanitized versions that appeared in account books, but the African names, the family names, the names that connected people to histories that slavery had tried to erase. Speaking them felt like confession, acknowledgement, and prayer, combined into something that hurt her throat but lightened her chest. Acknowledgement carried its own weight. Patience's ghost began responding to her mother's recitation of names, nodding when Margaret pronounced them correctly, shaking her head when shame or fear caused mispronunciation. The dead child had become a teacher, instructing her mother in recognition of humanity that had always existed but had been systematically ignored. Thomas had fled to Richmond, seeking legal counsel and political protection from men whose own fortunes depended on maintaining slavery's legitimacy. But his absence left Margaret alone, with evidence that couldn't be denied, and a daughter whose death had given her access to truth that the living had spent lifetimes concealing. Personal letter. Margaret to Thomas Whitmore. November 20, 1859. I can no longer pretend ignorance of what we've done. Patience shows me faces of people we destroyed, their children, their names. I see them all now, and they see me seeing them. Dr. Carey returned with a larger group of clergymen, hoping that collective religious authority could accomplish what individual prayer had failed to achieve. But their attempt at exorcism was interrupted by manifestations that overwhelmed their theological framework, entire families of enslaved people appearing in the nursery. Some bearing wounds from punishments that had killed them, others holding children who'd been sold away and died in distant plantations. The supernatural gathering wasn't malevolent, but it was unavoidable. Spirits filled every room in Whitmore Manor, not threatening violence, but demanding recognition. They wanted their stories told, their deaths acknowledged, their names spoken aloud by people who'd profited from their erasure. Margaret found herself serving as medium between the living and dead, translating testimonies that had been silenced for generations into language that white authorities could understand and document. The process was exhausting. Each story carried emotional weight that threatened to crush her, but Patience's presence provided strength to continue bearing witness to truth that was larger than any individual family's guilt. Some truths demand collective confession. Sheriff Patterson documented Margaret's testimonies with growing alarm, recognizing that the revelations implicated not just the Whitmore plantation, but an entire economic system that depended on systematic dehumanization. The dead were providing evidence of crimes that extended throughout Virginia's plantation network, connecting families whose social respectability had been purchased through coordinated brutality. But documentation alone wouldn't satisfy the spirits who filled Whitmore Manor. They wanted justice that went beyond earthly courts, reparations that exceeded financial compensation, acknowledgement that transformed how the living understood their relationship to suffering they'd ignored or enabled. Margaret began liquidating the plantation's assets, not to flee like Thomas, but to begin paying debts that couldn't be calculated in currency. She sold furniture, jewelry, artwork, everything that represented wealth accumulated through slavery, and used the proceeds to purchase freedom for enslaved people on neighboring plantations. Freedom became the only acceptable currency. The enslaved people at Whitmore Manor received their manumission papers on November 24th, but many chose to remain on the property to witness the completion of Patience's supernatural investigation. They understood that the dead child was serving not just as their advocate, but as agent of justice that transcended individual grievances. Patience's manifestations grew gentler as her mother's confessions grew more complete. The ghostly child began appearing less frequently, but when she did manifest, her expression showed something: approaching peace. The carved messages on the nursery walls stopped multiplying, suggesting that the testimonies were nearing completion. What would you do if you discovered that the only way to help your dead child find peace was to destroy everything your family had built over generations? How far would you go to honor the humanity of people you'd spent your life treating as property? Margaret was about to learn that Patience's haunting had a purpose beyond exposure of past crimes. The dead child was preparing to deliver a final revelation that would transform Whitmore Manor from a monument to slavery's prophets into something entirely different, but only if her mother proved willing to make the ultimate sacrifice that love sometimes demands. Margaret Whitmore signed the deed, transferring ownership of Whitmore Manor to the freed enslaved community at sunrise on November 28, 1859, while Patience's ghost stood beside the massive oak dining table where 3 generations of her family had planned the systematic destruction of human lives disguised as business transactions. The legal document represented more than property transfer. It was acknowledgement that the house had never rightfully belonged to the people who'd built their wealth on its foundation of suffering. When justice finally arrives after generations of delay, it demands not just punishment of the guilty, but restoration of what was stolen, even when that restoration requires the complete destruction of everything the perpetrators considered their legacy. The deed transfer was witnessed by Sheriff Patterson, Dr. Carey, and 12 freed people who would form the governing council for what had been the Whitmore Plantation. Margaret retained nothing: no personal possessions, no financial assets, no legal claim to property that had been purchased with money earned through slavery's profits. Thomas had sent desperate letters from Richmond, threatening legal action to prevent the property transfer, but Virginia courts were reluctant to intervene in cases involving supernatural manifestations. The practical reality was that no one wanted to purchase or occupy a plantation where ghosts provided testimony about crimes that implicated half of Virginia's planter class. Richmond Inquirer. Legal notice, November 29, 1859. Whitmore Manor property transferred to community of former slaves. Transfer legally binding despite unusual circumstances surrounding decision. No appeals filed. Patience's manifestations reached their peak during the deed signing ceremony, with dozens of spirits appearing throughout the manor house, not threatening or malevolent, but serving as witnesses to justice that had been delayed for generations. The dead filled every room, corridor, and staircase, their presence transforming the house from symbol of oppression into monument, to recognition and acknowledgement. But the supernatural gathering wasn't celebratory. The spirits understood that legal justice, even when complete, couldn't undo the suffering they'd endured or restore the lives that slavery had destroyed. Justice served recognition rather than revenge, acknowledgement rather than resurrection. Margaret prepared to leave Virginia entirely, carrying only the clothes she wore and a small Bible that had belonged to Patience. She'd arranged passage to Ohio, where she planned to work with abolitionists who could use her testimony about slavery's practical operations to strengthen their arguments for immediate emancipation. Some redemption required total sacrifice. On the morning of her departure, Margaret returned to the nursery for a final conversation with her daughter's spirit. Patience appeared more solid than she'd been since death, her translucent form gaining substance as her mission neared completion. The carved messages on the walls and floor had stopped multiplying, suggesting that all testimonies had been recorded and acknowledged. "Are you ready to go now?" Margaret asked, kneeling beside her daughter's ghost. Patience shook her head slowly. "Not yet. There's one more thing." The final revelation came through words carved into the nursery's wooden floor with supernatural speed, letters appearing as Margaret watched. The house remembers everyone who lived here. The house will teach anyone who listens. Margaret understood that Patience's haunting had transformed Whitmore Manor into something unprecedented, a place where the dead could communicate with the living, where suppressed histories could be recovered and preserved, where justice delayed could finally be acknowledged and addressed. The house had become a courthouse. Patience's ghost began to fade as the sun rose higher, her mission approaching completion, but not entirely finished. She would remain at Whitmore Manor, serving as guardian and guide for anyone seeking to understand slavery's true cost or learn from testimony that had been silenced for generations. The freed people who inherited the property understood their responsibility as custodians of truth that extended beyond their personal experiences. They would preserve the supernatural archive that Patience had created, ensuring that future generations could access testimonies from people whose voices had been systematically erased. What would you do if you inherited a house that contained the voices of everyone who'd ever suffered within its walls? How would you balance the need to preserve painful truths with the desire to create new possibilities for healing and growth? Margaret's final gift to her daughter was the acknowledgement that some children are born carrying responsibilities that exceed their earthly lifespans, and Patience's death had revealed a purpose that made her brief life infinitely more meaningful than any conventional childhood could have provided. But that meaning would soon extend beyond the borders of Virginia. As news of the haunted plantation spread to abolitionists who recognized the supernatural testimonies as evidence that could transform the entire national debate about slavery's moral legitimacy, the abolitionist delegation arrived at Whitmore Manor on December 15, 1859, led by William Lloyd Garrison himself, who'd traveled from Boston after receiving Margaret's detailed letters describing supernatural testimonies that provided unprecedented documentation of slavery's systematic brutalities. The delegation found a transformed property where freed people had established a community dedicated to preserving the voices of the dead while building new possibilities for the living. But they also discovered that Patience's ghost had evolved beyond her original mission into something that challenged every assumption about childhood, death, and justice. When the dead refuse to accept the limitations that mortality typically imposes, they create new categories of existence that force the living to reconsider fundamental beliefs about what children can accomplish and what death actually means. Garrison's interview with Patience's ghost lasted 3 hours, conducted in the nursery where carved testimonies covered every surface like a three-dimensional archive of suppressed history. The dead child answered questions with the precision of someone who'd had unlimited time to study evidence, providing details about slavery's operations that no living witness could verify, but which documentary records later confirmed as accurate. The supernatural testimonies were transcribed and published in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North, creating the first systematic documentation of slavery's psychological and spiritual costs, written from the perspective of its victims. Patience had become not just advocate for the dead, but historian for experiences that conventional sources had systematically ignored or denied. The Liberator, December 30, 1859. Child Ghost provides testimony documenting 347 deaths attributable to plantation cruelty, evidence verified through multiple sources. Virginia authorities refuse to investigate supernatural claims, but cannot dispute documentary proof. But Patience's manifestations had grown beyond simple testimony into something approaching prophecy. She began appearing to visitors with warnings about the approaching war that slavery's contradictions would inevitably generate. Her ghostly form would point toward Richmond, then Washington, speaking of battles that hadn't been fought and casualties that hadn't been calculated. The freed community at Whitmore Manor established a school in the manor house, using Patience's supernatural archive as teaching material for children who would grow up knowing the true cost of the prosperity that previous generations had taken for granted. The dead child served as their most effective instructor, providing lessons that no conventional education could deliver. Margaret never returned to Virginia, but she maintained correspondence with the community that had inherited her family's property. Her letters described work with the Underground Railroad, where her intimate knowledge of slavery's operations made her an effective guide for people seeking freedom and justice that earthly systems couldn't provide. Heaven's refusal created earthly purpose. Thomas Whitmore died in Richmond on March 4, 1860, officially from heart failure, but actually from the accumulated weight of guilt that Patience's testimonies had forced him to acknowledge. His final letters contained confessions that implicated dozens of other planters in crimes that legal systems had refused to prosecute, but which supernatural justice had documented for eternal preservation. Dr. Carey continued studying Patience's manifestations until his own death in 1873, eventually concluding that some children are born already connected to spiritual networks that extend beyond individual lifespans. His medical journals describe Patience as proof that consciousness could survive death when it served purposes larger than personal existence. The nursery where Patience died became a pilgrimage site for people seeking justice that conventional systems couldn't deliver. Families of missing people, survivors of systematic oppression, and individuals carrying guilt that exceeded their ability to process alone would visit the room where a dead child continued serving as advocate for anyone whose voice had been systematically silenced. Some deaths generate more life than birth. Patience's ghost remained active at Whitmore Manor throughout the Civil War, appearing to Union soldiers who occupied the property and providing them with detailed information about Confederate supply routes, hidden weapons, and local sympathizers who posed threats to federal forces. Her supernatural intelligence network proved more reliable than conventional military reconnaissance. The war that Patience had predicted arrived exactly as she described, with casualties that matched her ghostly calculations and outcomes that fulfilled her supernatural prophecies. But even after slavery's legal abolition, her manifestations continued because legal freedom couldn't address spiritual debts that had accumulated over centuries of systematic dehumanization. What legacy would you choose if you discovered that death wasn't an ending, but a transformation into something more powerful than life had ever allowed you to become? How would you use eternity if it meant serving as eternal advocate for people whose voices had been permanently silenced? Patience's answer was to remain at Whitmore Manor, serving as bridge between the living and dead, ensuring that suppressed histories remained accessible to anyone willing to listen, and demonstrating that some children carry purposes that exceed the limitations typically associated with childhood innocence or mortality's boundaries. They say that visitors to the ruins of Whitmore Manor can still hear a child's voice reciting names at sunset, and sometimes people report seeing a small figure in white standing beside historical markers that commemorate the enslaved people who died on the property, as if death had given her not peace, but the power to ensure that their stories would never again be forgotten by generations too comfortable with ignorance to seek uncomfortable truths. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.